Hello and welcome to my best books of 2022. Yeah, this is essentially exactly what the title says. It's just all my favorite books that I read in 2022. Obviously not all published in 2022, just like the favorite things that I read. I didn't include any rereads, and yeah, that's basically it. Everything on this list I gave 5 stars. I have 10 things, assuming that you include the series as a singular item, which I am, because that 10 sounds a lot better than 14. So I have 10 books essentially to talk about here, plus 2 honorable mentions that did not get 5 stars, so technically I couldn't put them on the list, but I wanted to include them. The weird thing about this list, well, 2 weird things. First of all, I have a lot. Like, 10 books plus 2 honorable mentions is a lot for me. Like, I would say usually like 3 to 5 5-star reads a year is where I usually land. I like to save my 5 stars for books that are like not just really wonderful books that I loved, but things that are like truly special to me, like books that were life-changing sounds dramatic, but like books that hold a special place in my heart, like books that are going to be favorites for a very, very long time, not just books that I loved. So usually I have fewer. I have a lot, which I had a really good reading year. I read more than I usually do, and I really enjoyed a lot of what I read. And the other odd thing is that this list is 50-50 fiction and nonfiction, which is fine. I really like both, but it's a little bit weird to me because I definitely read more fiction novels last year than I read nonfiction. So it's just odd to me that this list is 50-50 when my reading wasn't 50-50. But that's fine. That's just, how the cookie crumbled, as it were. I'm gonna start with my honorable mentions. The first is a book that I read in December, Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is a nonfiction book about the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma. It basically just delves into 3 generations of the Sackler family, who they owned Purdue Pharma, which was the company that produced OxyContin and the opioid epidemic, as it were. The book is just a deep dive into them from the 1920s till present day, and it's really, really fascinating. I only gave it 4 stars at the time, but I do feel like I maybe undervalued it a bit because I loved it so much, and I did feel like it deserved a mention on this list because it was so fascinating. I love nonfiction that's just like deep dives into a particular subject to just like give you so much information, and it was so well done. And I'm not changing my rating because I don't do that unless I reread the book, but it was just really, really wonderful, and I would highly recommend if you have like any interest at all in the pharmaceutical industry, in like a really rich family over multiple generations. Fascinating book. And I'm not like a scientifically inclined person, so you could definitely read it like not knowing basically anything. And then my second honorable mention is an author, Jane Harper. She's an Australian mystery thriller writer. She's written The Lost Man, The Survivors, Force of Nature. I discovered her this year. She's very well known, so like that sounds condescending, but I read her for the first time this year, and I read all of her books. I gave most of them 4 stars. None of them got 5, so she's not like technically on this list, but again, I felt like she deserved a mention because she writes really wonderful, slow-paced, dramatic thrillers. Like, not a whole lot happens, but they're so interesting and so well done. And the stories and characters are so well constructed. The Survivors was my favorite. It's about like a small island off the coast of Australia where, a massive storm had happened like 10 years before, and now a guy whose older brother died in that storm, who everyone kind of blames for his older brother's death, comes back to town, and like there are lots of secrets, and it was fantastic. I felt like it would be kind of remiss of me not to mention her on this list because I did really, really love her book so much, and just like finding her as an author this year. So 10 out of 10 would recommend if you like slow-paced thrillers. And then we get on to the actual best list. I gave all of these 5 stars. These are in no particular order. I'm not ranking them because I don't like to do that with my favorites. I just don't. So all of these are equally wonderful, and I would highly recommend literally all of them. I'm going to start with my favorite author because I feel like I usually end videos with her, And if people are only going to watch the first few minutes, let's talk about Ellen Emerson White. Let me spread the good word of Ellen Emerson White, in case y'all haven't heard of her. So, she is my favorite author. I've been reading her for years. And this year, I read her series, Echo Company, and the companion novel, The Road Home, which I gave all of them 5 stars except for Hill 568, which is the second book in the Echo Company series. Ellen Emerson White is mostly a young adult and male grade realistic fiction author. The Echo Company series is a historical fiction, kind of YA, kind of new adult series. It's about, 18-year-olds in the war. It follows a specific company and a squad within that company, mostly focused on Michael, who's a new guy in Vietnam. He got drafted, he doesn't want to be there, but neither did he want to escape to Canada, so he kind of decided that going to Vietnam was the best option he had after getting drafted. And it just follows his time in Vietnam. And then, in the third book, they meet Rebecca, who is a nurse. The Road Home focuses on Rebecca, but she winds up on a helicopter on a mission to get an injured soldier. The helicopter gets shot down, and the 2 men she are with die. She winds up on her own in Vietnam, not knowing where she is, not knowing anything, and then she runs into a Vietnamese soldier, and it kind of goes from there. And then The Road Home, this happens in the third book of the Echo Company series, and then The Road Home focuses entirely on her. It follows her last few months in Vietnam, and then the second half of the book takes place when she goes home, and it deals a lot with like her trauma, her PTSD, her dealing with what she saw in Vietnam as a nurse in one of the major emergency room hospitals in the country. And it just kind of deals with everyone and everyone's trauma and just like what happened. And I loved this series so much. I love Ellen Emerson White. I'm just gonna hold up this book, but like the whole Echo Company series, fantastic. All of these, fantastic. I cried so hard. I spent the majority of this book in tears. Like, I'm pretty sure I spent more time crying than not crying. It's one of my favorite series. I wasn't expecting to love this so much because I don't generally like wartime books. I much prefer like kind of what the second half of this was, which was like dealing with the trauma after the fact. Like, that's more my speed. But honestly, the combat stuff was equally as good. It's so well written. The characters are so fantastic. Ellen Emerson White does a fantastic job of writing really relatable, wonderful characters that you just connect with so well. Like, they feel like normal people. They feel almost like they could be you. And you just get so attached to them, and they just break your heart in the smallest of ways. Like, it's not the deaths that take place in this book, although, like, it is a wartime book. People die. But it's, like, the small things. Like, one of the boys in the Echo Company series has a dog at home, and, like, every month his younger brother sends him pictures of the dog, like, dressed up in ridiculous ways with, like, a magazine cover from that month because he's so afraid that the dog is gonna die and they won't tell him. And it's just, like, utterly heartbreaking, like, in the smallest ways. And this book also happens to be one of the highest rated books on my shelf. Like, this book is vastly underread, but absolutely beloved by the people who read it, which I feel like is Ellen Emerson White as a whole. Like, the people who've read her adore her, and then the people who haven't just, like, don't know she exists. But, like, if you like young adult realistic fiction, or, like, honestly, even adult, because, like, the characters in these books really range from, like, 18 to 22, I would recommend these so much. I would recommend anything she writes. Please read her. Like, I feel like every other video on my channel is just begging people to read her because she deserves it, and you deserve to have her in your life. Guest House for Young Widows Among the Women of ISIS by Azadeh Moaveni. This is a nonfiction book about women who joined ISIS and kind of just like the variety of women who join ISIS and kind of exploring why they join and what pushes them into ISIS and kind of what we can do as a culture to combat this, and like why these girls feel like they're being pushed to join ISIS. And it really does cover like a vast spectrum. Like, it focuses on teenage British girls. It focuses on a white German girl who converts to Islam in her late teens and then eventually falls into extremism. it follows women in Syria who didn't really have a choice, who just happened to be there, and it was just like, well, you can fight it and have very difficult lives and probably die, or just accept it and like have much easier lives and much more safety. It picks like 7 or 8 women and just follows them and their journeys and like how far they fell into ISIS. And this was wonderful. Like, it's so interesting because I feel like this is a subject that isn't widely discussed, like why people join ISIS, especially Western girls, but like it focused on all sides of the spectrum. This was one of those books that I kind of knew I was going to love from the moment I saw it, and it just took me a couple years to find myself a copy, but it's so interesting. Like, it just explored so much that I had never thought of as, you know, a white woman living in America, not knowing much about Islam. And it is like very pointed. It's specifically focusing on religious extremists. It's not about Islam as a whole. But it is very, very interesting. Like, you see these girls who are looking for something, and religious extremism is the only place they feel they're finding it. And like how society has failed them to put them in that position to begin with. And it was just so interesting. Like, I remember one thing in particular she said in this book. I read this at the beginning of the year. That's why like my thoughts are a little bit jumbled. Like, I read Echo Company in November, and then I read this in like January or something. I remember she was discussing one girl who lived in Tunisia, and she was discussing how even though Islam was the major religion that was practiced in that country, Islamic religion was so limited and people didn't actually read the Quran. So when they heard religious extremists, it gave them a connection to their religion that they weren't finding anywhere else. And they didn't actually have the knowledge to like combat the extremists and like the illogical parts of the extremist speech, which was just like such an interesting thing to discuss. And like, this whole book was so well done. Like, the only thing was I wanted more of it. Like, it was so interesting, and she just had such limited access to a lot of these women on account of the fact that they were literally terrorists, you know? Like, she didn't have unlimited access. She was just working with the knowledge she had, but it was so interesting. Like, I would just, if this at all seems interesting to you, I would highly recommend picking it up. A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is, of course, a children's classic about a young, wealthy girl who's treated like a princess by her father, and she goes to a boarding school, and because she is like the wealthiest girl there, she's treated with absolutely every luxury in existence, and people just fawn all over her. And despite this, she's like the sweetest, nicest little girl. And then her father dies and leaves her with no money, and she goes from being treated like a princess to being treated like garbage, but she is still the sweetest, nicest girl in the whole world, and it just follows her, and it is so lovely. Like, I figured I would probably enjoy this because I did really love The Secret Garden as a kid, but I just cried throughout this book. Like, it's too sweet. Like, it's too lovely. If you're someone who doesn't like really wholesomely sweet and lovely things, like, this is gonna be way too much for you, because it was a lot. But it was so good. Like, it was too much. It was kind of overwhelming in the sweetness, and I just completely fell into that. Like, it hurt my soul in the way that made me feel good. Like, I just loved her story, and like, you know how it's going to end. It doesn't handle race and class very well at all, but I still loved it. Like, I don't know, for all its flaws, I just couldn't help but fall in love with this story and fall in love with this little girl. What was her name? Sarah Crew. And it's just so sad because like, her beloved father dies, and not only does he die and she's dealing with this trauma, but like, she winds up being forced to go sleep in the very cold, very bare attic. She winds up being half starved, and like, she is friendless and alone, and she's still being so nice to everyone because she thinks that's what people should do. Like, this touched my soul. This will definitely be something I reread frequently because it's just absolutely wonderful. And this book in particular has really beautiful illustrations. It's illustrated by Tasha Tudor, and they're just like perfect for this kind of story. Like, if you haven't read this and you like sweet childhood classics, I highly recommend. I cried. It was absolutely adorable. Committing Journalism, The Prison Writings of Red Hog by Dannie M. Martin and Peter Y. Sussman. This is a nonfiction journalism collection. Dannie M. Martin was a bank robber. He basically described himself as a career criminal. He was in and out of prison and juvenile reform since he was like 10. He was addicted to heroin, I think. He was addicted to drugs and spent most of his life addicted and like robbing banks and robbing convenience stores and just like living a life of crime. And then he got caught for robbing a bank once and got a 20-year prison sentence and was just in prison for a very, very long time. I think like 10 years of that sentence or something. And while he was in prison, he started writing. He started writing about being in prison and what it was like and various prison reform and etc., etc. He started submitting these to newspapers, and one of them was the San Francisco Chronicle, where Peter Sussman worked, and they formed a relationship, and Dannie Martin kind of exclusively published with Peter Sussman for a great many years until he got out of prison and continued on with his life. And this is just like, it's like half a collection of some of his writings from the time and like half context where Peter Sussman kind of writes in what was going on in Dannie Martin's life, like what was going on with his imprisonment, because at a point like the prison officials were not pleased that he was writing about how horribly the prison was treating its people and like a lot of like medical problems prisoners had and like prisoners who died because they weren't given medical treatment in time. And you know, he wrote about a lot of things, and he wrote about like legal reforms of like 3-strike laws and people who like had very little criminal past and yet were in prison for the rest of their lives. And very interesting stuff. This was probably the biggest surprise of the year because I did expect to enjoy this, but I didn't expect to love it. It was just like everything I liked. Like, this book was wonderful. I loved reading his articles. Like, his articles are very interesting and he has a very strong voice, but also I really loved the context behind them and really learning about his life and like kind of what was influencing these articles. And you get so much more of the story by reading this book than you would just reading his articles alone. And it was so fantastic. I will say most of these articles are from the 80s. This book was published in the early 90s. So like just going in, if you're looking for a lot of prison reform discussion, it is very like, I don't want to say outdated because a lot of it is still very relevant to today, but it is like 40 years old. So just know that going in. And I do feel like you have to be interested in journalism specifically to read this book because so much of this is about journalism and just like the writing process and the publishing process and the effect that had on Dannie Martin's time in prison. But it was so fascinating. Like, if you are interested in journalism, pick this up. Like, it was wonderful. Like, I got so much out of reading this, like so much more than I expected. I absolutely adored it. Like, this is one that I could honestly see myself rereading. Just like, I don't generally reread journalism books. Like, one time, very worthwhile, but like, I want to go back to this at some point. It was so interesting and so well done and just an absolutely fantastic read. The Book of Essie by Meghan MacLean Weir. This is a contemporary. I don't know if I can call this young adult. I don't know what it's shelved as. It's like half young adult, half adult, because some of the characters are adults. But the main character, Essie, is a 17-year-old girl who is pregnant, which like is a problematic situation to be in. But her family is the star of a evangelical reality show. It's basically inspired by the Duggars, I would say, or like a Duggar type show. It's just the father is the preacher, the mother is a housewife, and it's about their religion and their family, and these kids have basically grown up on this reality show, and it's a very like toxic religious situation, like very cult like. It's not like a positive religious atmosphere. And Essie being pregnant as an unmarried 17-year-old presents a lot of problems. So it's a lot about like, well, first of all, the mystery is how did she get pregnant? Because that is something that you don't know going in. But largely the show is just about like public perception and how the family deals with that and how Essie deals with that. and how much manipulation goes into how they are perceived and like their images. And it's very, very interesting. Like, I love things that are behind the scenes of like TV shows or politics or anything where like it is largely about like manipulation and like making yourself the image that you want to portray. Like, it's about the persona, not you, if that makes sense. I'm terrible at explaining this, but I love that. Like, that is something that's very, very interesting to me. So I love this book for that element. And Essie was such an interesting character. I loved getting behind her. I loved seeing like how she was dealing with this and how she was like manipulating everyone around her subtly so that she was controlling her own narrative and she was controlling her own life kind of without other people realizing it. She's like very intelligent and very shrewd and just like very willing to be the bad guy sometimes in order to get what she needs. And it's a wonderful book. Like, it's so dark. Like, there's a lot of like dark subject matter discussed, like rape, but wonderful book. I love it. It's so interesting. It's so much about just like behind the scenes and manipulation, and it was exactly the kind of book for me. And it was one of those that I just vibed I was going to love it, and then I read it and I did really, really love it. So absolutely wonderful book. Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption by Bryan Stevenson. This is another nonfiction book. Bryan Stevenson runs the Equal Justice Initiative, which focuses out of Mississippi, somewhere in the South, where he's a lawyer and he basically defends a lot of death penalty cases, but also a lot of people who've been unjustly convicted, who didn't get the defense that they deserved, who are maybe like victims of harsher penalties than they should have received. A lot of people who are poor, who couldn't afford good lawyers, a lot of people who have other difficulties like mental illness or mental disabilities that kind of prevented them from defending themselves well, and just like a lot of people in prison who need help. That's who he helps. This book focuses a lot on just like the people he helps in general, but also Walter MacLean, who was a black man who was put on death row for the murder of a white woman in, I think, the 80s-ish, maybe 70s. And it was a very like racist case. Like, it was about like racism. People just automatically blamed him because they knew that he'd been having an affair with a white woman that very much offended the town's sensibilities. And Bryan Stevenson defended him, just like initially trying to get him off death row and then realizing that like this man is not just like the victim of a racist conviction, like this man is straight up innocent. And he wound up getting Walter MacLean off and like freeing him from prison, and as well as helping a lot of other people in a lot of different ways. Fascinating, so interesting, and so well done. Bryan Stevenson has done so much. Like, just reading this book, you can tell like it is wonderful. Like, I absolutely adored this. I love legal stuff. Like, I think the law is fascinating. I love the intricacies of it, and I just love the way he worked it into this book. Like, it is a lot about law, but it's mostly about like social justice reform and like him helping people and like the ways in which the law penalizes poor people and people of color and other marginalized groups, and what he can do and what we can do to make that better. You know, it discusses a lot about like the flaws in the justice system and like his legal arguments that have made it to the Supreme Court to like limit the amount of time spent in prison for like children who are convicted of crimes, like 13-year-olds. One 13-year-old, probably with mental disabilities, accidentally set a fire that killed 2 boys and received life in prison. And it discussed her case a lot and his defense of her. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, but it's so wonderful. Long Bright River by Liz Moore. Liz Moore is another one of my favorite authors. She wrote The Unseen World, which is maybe my favorite book of all time. Absolutely wonderful book. This is an adult contemporary novel, kind of thriller-esque, but not like fully a thriller, about a woman who's a cop and there's a serial killer who's going after sex workers in kind of her district, and she's very concerned about this in a personal way. Her sister is a sex worker who's addicted to heroin, and their lives have just kind of gone 2 different directions, and they're estranged now, but she still drives through like her sister's side of town looking for her sister on the street, like, every week, just to make sure her sister is okay, like, or not okay, but still alive. She's also a single mother of a young son, and she's just kind of like trying to deal with her life. As the serial killer is going after sex workers, her sister goes missing. She realizes that she hasn't seen her sister in a few weeks, and that none of her sister's friends have seen her in a few weeks. So she starts looking into the serial killer, looking into her sister's disappearance, and finds out a lot of things about cops that she maybe had been overlooking. I gave this 5 stars, obviously. Obviously. It was wonderful. It was so interesting. I said it's thriller-esque because it definitely is more on the contemporary side of things. Like, it's about this serial killer and her sister going missing, which sounds like a thriller, but it's much more just like a character study of these people and these families and how their lives have gone in these totally separate ways. And it's so, so good. Like, I absolutely adored this. I don't know how to talk about it. Like, Liz Moore is so good with character, and she's so good with writing these slow, really detailed stories that capture everything that you could want. They just feel so full and complex, and it's like there's nothing in them that is extraneous or boring. It's just like all forms this very complete story. Like, you are seeing everything, and it's wonderful. I demolished this in like a day. And it's thick. Like, this is a thick book, and I just went through it so fast. It offers so much commentary on the world, you know, on like what it is to be a sex worker and how you're treated, and how a serial killer of sex workers is treated differently than like a serial killer of like middle-class white women. And it's just like how your status kind of changes the way the world treats you. And I don't know, this all sounds very dumb and shallow, but it's not. This book has so much interesting commentary in it, and the characters are wonderful, and the story's wonderful, and like you kind of know where it's going from the beginning in terms of like the mystery element, but it's like that's not important. Like, it's not about the mystery, it's about these people's growth, and you really do get to see them grow wonderfully. Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a nonfiction memoir of a woman who was raped. Chanel Miller was the victim in the Stanford rape case, which was very well known a few years back, and then at the time, she was known as Emily Doe, and she wrote a victim impact statement that was widely shared, and she eventually made her identity known, and she wrote a book about her experiences both being sexually assaulted and her experiences in the justice system, and what it was like to be on trial, and the delays of that trial, and how that trial affected her incredibly deeply and was in some ways as traumatizing as the sexual assault itself. And this is just Chanel Miller's story. Absolutely wonderful, so powerful. Like, this book was a very, very hard, very emotional read. Like, I can't remember ever being like hurt as much as this book hurt me. Like, it does just like open this grief inside of you as you're reading it. Like, it's so wonderfully written. Her writing is gorgeous. Like, I adore her writing style. I wouldn't change it for the world. Like, I wouldn't change a single word in this book. It was just beautiful and so painful, and it's like the beauty of her writing and the way she expresses her pain makes it hurt all that much more. And I cannot recommend this enough. Like, if you at all think you can handle a book like this, I would 100% read it, because she shares so much of what she went through in the media, and just like seeing the way people talked about her and the way people talked about like her pain that like they, you know, knew very little about, and the way the trial itself affected her. It hurt me so bad, and it is such a wonderful book. I hope she keeps writing, like, honestly, like, not just about her own story and what she's been through, but like in general, because she has such a beautiful writing style. And I would highly, highly suggest reading this if you think you can handle it, because I do think this is a very difficult book to read, emotional wise, and I do think it would be too much for some people. But if you can't read this, then I would recommend at least reading her victim impact statement, which is widely available online. It's basically just a much shorter version of this book. The Girls at 17 Swan Street by Yara Zgheib. This is an adult contemporary novel about a young woman who has an eating disorder, She's a French woman who used to be a dancer, and then she moves to Missouri with her husband, who she is very much in love with, and winds up not being a dancer in Missouri. She works in a grocery store, and as her life kind of feels like it's crumbling, she falls further and further into an eating disorder that she's kind of had for years. She goes to an in-treatment facility at 17 Swan Street along with a number of other women, and kind of confronts her eating disorder and the problems that she's had for years and the cause of her eating disorder. And it's a really beautifully written book. Like, I love the writing style of this. This ties the past and the present together so seamlessly. Like, it is gorgeous. It's so smooth and it flows so well, and it's just like, I love the way she writes it, because it's not entirely artistic and weird, but it's like a very kind of standard writing, but with like this artistic flair that just makes it like so much beautiful and so much more than it would be otherwise. Like, it's just absolutely lovely. And I love the character development of Anna and like what she's been through in her life, and you kind of see how her memories of like wonderful situations are kind of different than what she remembers them. Like, it confronts how the eating disorder has changed her life and changed her perception of her life in such a wonderful way. At one point, she was talking to her husband about a trip they'd taken to a different country, and like she was talking about how wonderful it was and how she remembered the strawberries they ate. They ate so many strawberries, and like it was just a wonderful trip, and like how in the times before her eating disorder they were so happy. And her husband was like, what are you talking about? We ate so many strawberries because that was the only thing that you would eat. And it was so emotional. Like, this book just hit me so hard. Like, if you're looking for a book that really captures eating disorders well, I'd highly recommend this. It was beautiful. The story is beautiful. The writing is beautiful. And the characters are beautiful. Like, this is just such a wonderful book. Like, I wanted to love this so bad, and it did not let me down at all. It was exactly as much as I hoped it could have been, and it was just highly recommend. And the last book I have to talk about is How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. This is a nonfiction book essentially about how slavery is treated in modern day America, like how we confront our past with slavery. He travels to a number of like historical places throughout the US. Like, he goes to Monticello, he goes to Angola prison, he goes to some other plantations. It's been a minute since I read this book. But he basically discusses how those places deal with slavery. Like, because at Monticello, Jefferson obviously held slaves, and he takes several slavery specific tours at Monticello. He interviews the tour guides there. He really does like a deep dive into how they've confronted slavery and their past with slavery, and how they educate people in modern day on slavery, because people wouldn't necessarily go to Monticello specifically to learn about slavery, but how that has become part of what it is, because you can't just separate slavery from a lot of what these places are. And it was just really wonderfully done. It was so interesting. He talks about a lot of really wonderful things. He goes to a Confederate church at one point to like see how they deal with slavery, and how it's, you know, absolutely disregarded in some places, and in some places that has become the entire purpose of the historical monument. And it's really wonderfully done. And he spends a whole section on Angola prison, which is a prison that was built on a former slave plantation. Basically what that means, and like how they confront slavery. And it's just such an interesting book that offers so much. Like, I adored every second that I was reading this. It was absolutely wonderful and absolutely worthwhile, and I would highly recommend this if you want to learn about slavery in America. It's less about slavery itself and like the history of slavery than it is like the modern day implications of it and how we address it today. But it's a very worthwhile book that I honestly think is very beneficial for most people to read. So those were all the books I read this year that were my absolute favorites. I'm hoping that 2023 will be just as good, because I had a really wonderful reading year last year. Like, I read so many good things. Like, all of these books are absolutely amazing, and all of these books are ones that will stay with me for a very long time. Let me know down below if you've read any of these and what you thought of them if you have, and let me know your favorite read of last year as well. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.